You've already gotten to know her a little bit through the movie, and what she's done is just so remarkable. I mean, I think we think at the Indy, and probably a lot of other people think how difficult it is what we do, and we get nastiness on social media, but to do what you do, and in a small town with people you grew up with, and you mentioned some of the things, it's just remarkable. I'm not just saying it, it's truly remarkable. And so she needs no introduction, but I want to briefly introduce the other two people up there. Heather Courtney is a documentary director and producer who has several awards for her efforts, including an Emmy for Where the Soldiers Come From. I've also learned that Heather is a proud Yooper, meaning that you're from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So before we go any further, you need to answer one question. This is going to determine the tone of this entire discussion, okay? Wolverines or Spartans?
Packers.
That's a smart answer. I went to grad school at Michigan. Evan Smith, as I've already told you, is a legend. He's what we all aspire to be in nonprofit journalism, having built the Tribune in Texas into a juggernaut and a model that so many of us in this nonprofit journalism world, which essentially was non-existent when Evan started, and now has hundreds of essential copycats of what Evan has done. Well, we've all tried to emulate him, and by emulate, I mean shamelessly stolen every one of his ideas. Evan started the Trib in 2009 after a distinguished career at Texas Monthly, and he has provided invaluable counsel to me, both when I started the Indy and all along, and it is great to have my friend Evan Smith here. So thank you for coming, Evan. You can clap for him. It's all right. So I want to start with you, Heather, because I'm curious. Where the Soldiers Come From was a movie about these young men and what they went through, and this is a completely different subject matter, right? What drew you to this subject matter?
Well, I mean, all of my documentaries are different. A lot of different subjects. Before I did For the Record, I made a film about DACA students.
I saw that too.
Yeah, fighting for their education in Georgia. So it's mainly what makes me want to do a film is the people. So I spend a lot of time before I start a film or before I really get into production trying to get to know the people that I'm going to film, and that usually determines whether or not I'm going to continue, because all people have a story, and it's just a matter of whether or not they want to open up to you about it, or and also if they're fighting for something. And pretty much everyone in my films in their own ways are fighting for something. So with Laurie, actually I started filming right away, and like the first day I went there. But that was because I instantly felt, comfortable with Laurie and her staff. And,
How did you even know about her, Heather, though?
Well, actually, I don't know if any of you know Bill Bishop. He used to run the Daily Yonder, and he ran the Smithville, Texas paper, so he has a big history in rural journalism. And he used to live in Austin, and I lived in Austin, and I used to ask him about ideas for rural stories, because the reason I did Where Soldiers Come From, it's about kids from my hometown, which is a very small town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So I've always wanted, and that was another reason I felt very connected to Laurie and everyone there, and Canadian, because even though it's in Texas, it's a lot like my hometown. So anyway, Bill Bishop connected us. He said, "Oh, well, you should talk to Laurie up in Canadian. She's doing some great stuff." And I didn't really, he said, "Oh yeah," he kind of was just like, "You should just talk to her." But before I knew it, I was making a film about her. So.
And look, John, everybody in Texas knows about Laurie Ezzell Brown. Everybody knew about the Canadian Record. If you asked anybody in journalism in the big cities in Texas about the Canadian Record, they knew. So in a lot of ways, it was discovering more about a subject that we all thought we already knew, and a place and a person we already knew. So I love that Bill Bishop was the connector. I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of us have seen documentaries that stuck with us or that moved us, and they're really the ones that can bring the people alive and also bring issues alive. And you really did do a beautiful job with this film. I got to tell you, I don't want to watch it again. I don't like crying about this stuff, right? But it is so important. And Laurie, right near the beginning of this film, you asked the question that is the most important question, I think, for all of us. What happens if nobody is doing this? What happens? Tell me.
It's pretty obvious. There's a huge vacuum, and
Is this mic on? Can you guys hear her? I think yeah.
can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better, I think.
I think the smaller the town, the bigger the vacuum is. Actually, it's felt. It's more personal. Everything about the Canadian record in Canadian Texas is personal. People don't talk about it. They don't say the newspaper. They say my newspaper, our newspaper. They have ownership in it. And believe me, they'll let you know when they're not pleased with what you're doing. And it's so personal that, I mean, when my dad was editor, he said, you know, he believed that his desk should be at the very front of the office, right inside the front door, because when somebody had something to say to him, if they had an opinion that they wanted to express, they should have the ability to do it. They should walk in the door and say what they had to say. And it's not the easiest place to sit and write, but it certainly is. I mean, we're accessible to the public. We're part of the community. We're part of the heartbeat. We're part of daily life. And so its absence is felt deeply. And I don't know what else to say about it.
Well, tell us what the status is. I think some people are wondering by the end of the film, what's happened?
Well, the hardest part of that movie is when I say you can't quit. Because I did. I ran into more than I could handle, and we had a sale that fell through, and it's a long, sad story, but actually probably that sale deserved not to happen. Ultimately, I canceled it. I called it off. But we also got hit with a lawsuit the same week, and I realized at some point I was losing my employees. I was working all the time. I was not feeling great. I aged many, many years in that film. And I couldn't fight a lawsuit too and get a paper out. And so we suspended publication in the first week of March. And we right now are publishing news online, on our website, on our Facebook page, and it's not the extent of news that we've always done, or it's not very satisfying, but we are keeping the community informed. So,
I'm sorry to hear that. Go ahead.
I was
Heather.
just going to add, the lawsuit was dismissed because it was a bogus lawsuit, as most lawsuits against journalists are. And also, I mean, in my opinion, you haven't quit. You didn't quit. Like, she's still there at the paper every day trying to cover news in the best way she can. Like, as she said, posting on their site and Facebook, and still looking for a potential buyer, if anybody's out there. And yeah, so no, you haven't quit, Laurie.
It doesn't sound like you've quit. It feels like that to you?
well, I love the newspaper. You know,
That's clear.
I love the newspaper. I love the print.
Yeah.
I love the ink. I love laying out the pages of it. I love taking the pictures. I love covering all the news, being at all the meetings. I love people knowing that or paying attention. And in that sense, I think I have, to some extent, quit. I can't do all of that now. So, but that's our status, and we're still trying to find somebody to take over, and we're going to keep working on that. So.
No, you don't seem like an easy person to defeat, and I wish you the
No.
best luck. I love Evan. You know, I think a lot of people noticed in the film that there's one of the stickers that Heather zooms in on says "Support democracy, subscribe to independent journalism."
Right.
Talk about how important that is, and what the interconnection is, and what's going on across the country here.
Yeah, so I'm now, having stepped away as the CEO of the Tribune, I'm now consulting for a large foundation, Emerson Collective, that does about $20 million of investment in nonprofit journalism, grant making over the course of a year, coast to coast, border to border, organizations like the Nevada Independent and the Texas Tribune, in places where people have recognized that without a place to turn to get reliable, credible, independent information, people check out, people stop paying attention, they don't become civically engaged. Voter turnout in this country is well below what it ought to be, and the main reason for that is that people don't have a source of information that tells them, you know, there's an election happening, here are the candidates, here are the issues in play, here are the fights being waged in your name, here are the stakes that you have in the outcomes of these fights. You saw, Heather very helpfully included a couple of statistics, John, in this film, that since 2005, a quarter of American newspapers have closed. By 2025, in the 20-year period, 2 years from now, that will now be a third of the papers in this country will have shut down. A quarter of newsroom employees have lost their jobs in the last 15 years. And the statistic that really gets me is that 70 million Americans, a quarter of the population of this country, live in a community with no local source of news. Most of those are in communities of color. All of those are in counties where the median household income is below the national average. So the people who start behind the starting line of every race start behind the starting line of informedness, right? We live in two Americas, one informed and one not. And in the America that's not informed, all that's available to people is the crap in their feed, right? Misinformation, conspiracy theories. This is how we got to a place where 3 years later, with no evidence whatsoever, we're still debating whether the election in 2020 was stolen, or whether the pandemic was a hoax, or whether climate science is real. We need more good information to push out the bad. Ralston and I are old enough to remember when Pat Moynihan was a senator from New York, and he famously admonished us that we're all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. He must be spinning in his grave, because all over this country are people without a local source of news to turn to who have come to believe that they're entitled to their own facts. That is the poison coursing through our democracy's veins. And local news is the antidote to the poison. And I spend all my time traveling the country evangelizing on this subject and telling people, look, we can start out from an acceptable set of facts that we all agree on, and then we can disagree. That's how it used to be in this country. And now we can't even agree on what facts are or what truth is. So democracy is at risk. The bumper sticker is right. Informed communities strengthen democracy. I will have that tattooed at some point on my forearm, because I do believe that that is fundamentally the issue at play here.
It's not tattooed there now? Okay, all right.
No, nothing. But I really do believe that you have to make the connection for people in every community between informed citizens and a healthy democracy. And we're getting ready to rev up that engine again with the election next year. And it's same song, different verse, and we have to change it.
You know, it was interesting, Laurie, you talked about something that I've thought about a lot, and I've told people, and they can't even relate to it. Probably my young staff couldn't even relate to it. And you talk about how, and this is how it was at my house too. We ate dinner together. And we would talk about issues, not just, did you have a nice day in school, but did you see X happened? And my dad would make us talk about the issues of the day. And there has been just a gradual devolution of that kind of conversation among people. And even in a small town like Canadian, I mean, it's certainly happening in big cities, but you talked about that. And Evan almost quoted you directly when you said in the movie, right now I just want people to have good information. What I'm worried about, and Evan alluded to this, and we think about this all the time, is would they recognize good information when they got it, right? Isn't that an issue?
Well, it is an issue in news in general, in the news industry in general, it is. You saw the gentleman at the church talking about, well, we don't trust those other newspapers, but we trust Laurie. And that's, I mean, I don't know how to fix that. I know that they know who I am. They know what I believe. They know what my opinions are because I'm pretty open with them. But they also know, and here's a distinction that I think we've lost, and Evan, you might have some thoughts about this, but one of the distinctions we've lost in the news industry is the difference between opinion and news. And I think the news industry, to some extent, has done that to itself by blurring those lines between what just a factual news story is and what is an editorial opinion. My newspaper, every page has a header on it, and it says, this is opinion, this is news, this is sports. I mean, we're very clear about the distinction. And I'm really careful because I am both the reporter and the editorial writer. I'm very careful to report the news first. That's a standard I've had to hold myself to. I don't write an editorial. It doesn't matter how steamed up I am about something. I report the story first. And I try to, maintain that sort of, in my head, that same wall between the two things, because there are facts that have to be established and that have to be shared. And I have very carefully detailed those facts, and only then will I let myself write an opinion about something that I think is of such importance. So
I couldn't agree with you more about that. I'm constantly wrestling with the idea that people deserve accountability, but sometimes what the news business or news organizations give them is advocacy. And I think we should be about accountability. We should not be telling people what to think. We should be telling people to think. In my mind, that's a distinction without a difference. If we do our jobs as news organizations and we provide people with facts, information, knowledge, they're perfectly capable of taking that and then going to the next place with that, which is making a decision about what to do. I would like to see newspapers stop endorsing candidates. And I'm a broken record on this, and nobody wants to do that. But I think that every inch of a newspaper that is devoted to telling people in their audience, you should think this, you should believe this, do this. I'd rather see those pages repurposed for more reporting, or put the money in the bank, pay reporters better with that money, right? But you
Thanks,
know,
Evan.
it's
Thank you. And this is something that I'm wondering if you encountered or you saw when you were filming this. What a problem this is! It's what I call the validation culture that exists out there. People don't want to hear anything that's outside of what they already think is the truth, whether they have the facts to back it up. And you I mean, I'm not a very opinionated person, so I can't relate to this, okay? But I'm just wondering what it was like, what it is like for you in a small town, which 87% Trump, and your dad wrote some very strong editorials. You wrote some very, very, very strong editorials, and you probably know most of the people that when you go out, you know a lot of the people. I mean, they say, well, why should we trust any of your reporting in your paper, Laurie? Because we know that you wrote this editorial. Did you get a lot of that? We're not going to trust you because what you wrote. I mean, my reporters probably privately cuss me out all the time because I've put opinions out. No, they do it publicly. I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Well, I don't find it that difficult. I think when I started, when my dad died and I took over his role, I did worry about that a lot at first. But I sort of found a style of writing, a way of approaching very difficult topics editorially. And usually it was, I think if you can take something that is an issue on the national scale and bring it back down to your local scale and give people something, help us all find some commonality, common ground that we can start from, that we all understand, we all sort of see it from the same angle, and then sort of branch out from that and use that as your base for addressing these difficult subjects. I don't know how to really explain what that's like, but for me, that seemed to be the answer to that, is find common ground and work from there. And it's amazing, you can have some impact that way. And what you're doing is starting a conversation. And if you do it well, they'll respond. Our letters to the editor page is open to anybody. They have the same opportunity to express an opinion that I do. And they know that. And so I think that's it. It's their newspaper too. And they have the opportunity to express their opinions, and they use it. Less and less, I would say, in the last year or two. But it's always there, they know it, and it makes them feel like they have the same chance to say what they need to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, just as an observer, and as someone who has the same political views as Laurie does, I would just observe people in that town loved Laurie, they did. They would come into the office and talk to her. We had a screening in Canadian, Texas, and at the Palace Theater, which you see in the film. Yeah, it was awesome. Mm-hmm. And there was, hundreds of people there who love and adore Laurie, who I'm sure don't agree with most of her opinions. And I just feel like that's what's so important about local newspapers, because it actually does show the bridging of political divides. It's happening right there. They respect her, they trust her, she respects them and trusts them. And, local news really is a lot of reporting, as Laurie says, reporting on making the community a good place to live. And unfortunately, that all gets lost in the national news coverage and national politics. There's so much division, you can't, and I feel like in Canadian, I would see people talking to Laurie about things, and that just doesn't happen in a lot of places.
John, this goes back to the point that you made about the disappearance of the newspaper as an institution in a community. The newspaper used to be the public square in most communities. It was where everybody came together, rich or poor, whatever side of town you lived on, if you were black or Hispanic or white, old or young. You found people you didn't know in the newspaper. You litigated your differences in a civil way in the newspaper. You were reminded of the things that you agreed on in the newspaper. The newspaper was the place that was a safe space has now got a different connotation these days, but it was a safe space. The disappearance of the newspaper means that we've lost that. And now we live in the United States of confirmation bias, where you put headphones in your ears and walk down the street to keep the outside world out, and you curate your satellite radio dial and your cable box and your Twitter feed so that you don't encounter a point of view different from the one you already have. Right? This is what's killing us. What's killing us is that we no longer listen to or talk to people we disagree with. The Canadian Record is a place where people who don't agree on issues can still find a way to be civil to one another and get along. And that's been lost. It's been lost in small towns. and it's been lost in the big city.
I want to just bring up one more thing, and I hope there will be questions out there after I talk about this thing. And look, there's again something that you mentioned, Laurie, that I think is important, and it's the word conversation. And one of the things I think has that the media generally is seen as way too arrogant and aloof, and we know everything. Don't try to argue with us. And so, and generally, yeah, that's probably true of a lot of people in the media, but the only way for us to survive, and I get these emails every day from people yelling at me, saying, "I'm not going to read you anymore because of your leftist editorials and blah blah blah." And so, ordinarily, I would reply with some words that I wouldn't use here, but I've really learned, and I reply to all of these emails with the same first line, which is, "Thanks for writing. We don't have editorials. We have a very robust op-ed page. Please show me some examples." And some people will then just ghost me, of course, but others will come back and say, "I can't believe you responded," and they clearly aren't. But let me show you some of the pieces that I thought were slanted or wrong. You've got to be able to show people, especially in this age of the validation culture, et cetera, that you're willing to listen to them, even if you, at the beginning, seem to be on opposite sides of an issue. People can say, "Oh, Ralston's a jerk," not that would ever happen, or he's, I don't like what he says, but his reporters report the news fairly, and they're going to give us a fair hearing even if we complain. I mean, that's so important now, not just in a small place like Canadian, but in a place like Las Vegas, Austin, or anywhere else. You've got to show people that we are willing to listen to them as well as to impart information to them. Does that sound right? You can just say you're right, John. I love that part.
You're dead on, John.
Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
Mine is more of an observation. There's nobody young in here. You haven't talked about
What? What's your definition? What's your definition?
I haven't heard you. I'm sitting here and I understand. I'm from the jewelry industry and nobody has kids to hand their jewelry stores to. They are dying out. It's way different than what you're doing, but they are dying out. What about the young people? Aren't there photographers at the high school that want to learn from you? Aren't there, I don't understand that the young people, aren't there people, young ones that want to write? Don't we want to engage them, bring them in?
It's a great question. I actually think it's a great question because while there have been surges at times in the last decade and a half of young people getting more involved, of voting in big numbers, it's the biggest problem, I think, are younger people getting involved. How do we fix that?
Integrating them. How did you have young people come to your office and say, "I want to do photography, I want to write something"? Yes. And what happens with them?
Well, they don't last very long, but but they learn something while they're doing it. I found that kids today are so busy doing so many things that they don't have time for a job, an after-school job, or I've invited kids to write for the newspaper. I've certainly, my sports writer for the last several years was a young man that came in my office one day. I think he was in 7th or 8th grade, and he said, "I want to be a sports writer." And I said, "Okay, let's start." And I gave him assignments, and he started writing sports stories for me. And now he worked his way up, and he worked for the Regional Daily, and now he has his own online publication. And I'm certainly willing to do that. My problem now is I don't have a lot of time to spend teaching someone. Because I have so little staff and because I'm doing so many jobs, it's a little hard to find time to do it. And you don't find many kids who are just self-starters. I have found some, and they were treasures. Most of them did not go into the newspaper business, though. I don't know. I don't understand why not. I think it's a great business.
Yeah, and the few younger people that I met while I was filming the Canadian Record, they all moved, went off to college or went to another city to work or, yeah, so.
Look, I can tell you that here's where the big city and the small town, a lot we have in common actually in this problem, but this is where we're different. So the Tribune for about 12 years has had a fellowship program. That's what we would call our internships. We call them fellowships. And we had about 15 students from college, not down to the level of high school, but college students a year. And we paid them $6,600 a year, a semester, pardon me. So if they came and they interned with us for a semester, we would pay them a stipend. That was enough for them to pay a semester of tuition at any public university in Texas, and then also cover the expenses of books and other things. And we train them up, teach them the right values, tell them how to do this work the right way, not the wrong way. They haven't started to acquire bad habits that they have to unlearn at that point, so we can help them get out into the world the right way. And then we send them out into the world. And sometimes they come back and they work for us, sometimes, often, they come back and work for somebody else. We have one, Eric Dugeborn, who's working for the Nevada Independent, who's a terrific young reporter. And I can tell you that our experience in working with young people, you're exactly right. If we don't figure out a way to bring more people of that generation into the industry, and honestly, we're learning as much from them. This was a point that either John or Howard were making earlier today, that the young people in these newsrooms are teaching the old people in the newsrooms new ways to tell stories, new ways to think about platforms. You know, I don't need to live long enough to see Ralston on TikTok, but I will tell you that the way that information gets distributed these days has really expanded the possibilities for journalism, and so I think we have to embrace this.
Wait, I just want to add one thing to that.
Please.
I think another thing, though, is when you talk about community news at a local level, one of the problems is there's not a lot of journalism schools that even have classes about community news. And that's a big problem because they all want to, go write for a big online news company or be a broadcaster, or they don't even know that something like community news exists and how valuable that can be. So I think there should be more curriculum, more classes in journalism schools that cover this very important cover and train this very important issue of community and local news. So
did you want to say something? So I want to tell you that I'm significantly older than Evan, and when I started the Indy, one of the reasons I started it is I thought as a capstone to my career, it would be nice to use my experience and try to mentor young journalists, and because they would know more about what younger people might be thinking for one thing and try to draw them in, but they get a bad rap sometimes, right? And some of them are willing to work hard. And I have to tell you, Elizabeth and I were committed early on to a robust internship program that has expanded, and we have partnered with Pointer and Koch with their fellowships, which are phenomenal. Report for America we're applying for. There's all these great programs. I mean, except for the ancient Stutz, we have very, very young staff. I mean, most of my reporters are in their 20s, and they are teaching us something every day. They are phenomenal. And I'm not just saying that they're more technically savvy, which most of them are, but they have a different way of looking at things, and they're showing me things that I had no clue about. At that age, and so I think that they're being out there, they're being public. Some of them were on national cable news during the last election because Nevada's a battleground. They see young people like Tabitha's here or Jacob on TV, and they're young, and maybe that'll inspire younger people to be more involved or to go into journalism. So anyhow, we're trying. Go ahead. Go ahead, a young person. There is a young person here. Go.
I do think money is a big factor why people are not involved, but I have two questions.
Could you stand up? I think your voice might carry better. Go ahead. Thank you.
My first question is, will facts, like learning about facts and local news on a very factual level, change people's opinion? That's my first question. Second question is, now we're so globally intertwined, but I mean, something we buy today in the grocery store is sourced somewhere else, right? So their economics affects our economics. So I wanted to know, how does local news take into consideration the global trends? And do you do that in your local newspaper? So 2 questions.
Besides my desire to open a bureau in Paris, is that, go ahead.
I don't think you don't set out to change opinions. What you do is you set out to make sure people understand what facts are, where they come from, how you verify them, how you research them. There's a lot of, alternative facts is just the worst term I've ever heard in my life. There is no such thing. And so that's the first problem we have. And when the President of the United States is espousing alternative facts, you've got a problem. So I don't think you have to change their minds. You've got to teach people how to think, how to find good sources of information and use them. And I really think it's as simple as that. It's probably not that simple, but those are the basic problems there. And I forget what the other question was. I don't know that all small newspapers, all community newspapers do. I certainly had a pretty global view and tried to tie. That was, again, a way you could take something local and reference things that were happening on a larger scale, on a national or global scale. We are a microcosm. And I've found that more profoundly in recent years than ever, and it's something I want to write about a lot. In fact, I'd like to write a book about something that has to do with that. But we are a microcosm, and you can take things that happen right there in Canadian and extrapolate. You can expand that out to a larger scale. And that's that idea of having common ground, but finding a larger view or the larger scope. So I don't know how to say it better than that, but it's very important to me because I think all these things are connected. And everything I see happening in my town, I see the implications, the larger implications.
You guys want to add anything? You're good? Okay. Who else? Don't be shy. Oh, Tabitha's never shy.
So we just heard a discussion, and she mentioned too, costs, money. I mean, when we're talking about newspapers and journalism, a lot of young people are coming out with student debt. They're coming out with facing of finances. I mean, most people can't buy a home right now if they're starting out just by themselves without any other assets. What are things that are being done? Can we just have a short discussion about that and how you guys think about it? Because I think it's an undercurrent in what is happening, and it's a deterrent for many people who might want to participate in something like this.
John, can I start on that?
Please.
So 14 years ago when we started the Texas Tribune, I said then and have continued to say for all these years that journalism is a profession. Journalists are professional. They should be paid a professional wage, right? Your journalism is your people. And especially if here's where Laurie and I slightly diverge because Laurie has continued to be committed to a print product. I understand that. We never did. We started out saying we're going to untether ourselves from paper printing and postage, and we're going to take the money that we would have had to spend on those legacy costs that have been so problematic for the for-profit, traditional legacy newspapers. We're going to pour that back into journalism. Our journalism is our people. So when money comes in the door to support the work that we do, it goes back out the door in the form of salaries, generous benefits, retirement stuff. We build a compensation package for every person who comes in, especially young people who come in, to say you can actually make a living wage in this business. Now, I'd like to believe that every place is that way and that the philosophy of every place is that philosophy. I don't know that it is. But I think that all we can do, and honestly, it's a recruiting tool. I mean, if you want to be pragmatic about it as a boss, you want to hire somebody great from another place, you've got to present to them that you have generous benefits, salary, what have you. So I actually, in my own experience, would not say that there's a problem with young people coming into journalism, and that problem is that pay is not great, because I do think that there are places, maybe not every place, where people have prioritized compensation, because that's the thing that motivates people to do the work.
Have you ever had a reporter attend one of your events and essentially ask for a raise from the audience? Have you ever had that happen?
That's kind of what I think just happened now.
No, of course, it's true, though, and I do think that, should I tell how much I made when I started at the Las Vegas Review-Journal in 1984?
Very long time. So how much was your first salary?
$17,500.
My first salary out of graduate school in 1988 was $16,000.
Yeah.
Knoxville, Tennessee.
Yeah. And I listen, the other problem, I think, though, while everything that Tab said is true, and it's difficult, I do think we pay our people very well, and they have very good benefits. I do believe that. The problem is that some young people, too, have no perspective on that. They come into something, and they may not realize that what they're getting there is not too shabby for this business these days. You know, nobody gets into journalism and says, you know what, I'm gonna become really wealthy doing this. Now, some of us have done well, and there's nothing wrong with that. But no one's getting into this saying, you know, I'm gonna be a millionaire. And I don't think you did, for sure. Probably aren't a lot of millionaires in Canadian. Anyhow, but. I think it's much more important, and maybe some of my reporters would disagree with this, is you've got to give them the feeling that they're going to be embraced, that they're going to be listened to, too, that you are creating a culture where it's a collaboration as much as anything else. And I've really worked hard to try to do that at the Indy. You know, I'm not sure how successful we've been. I feel that that's my biggest accomplishment, more so than any of the great journalism that these reporters have done. But building a culture where people feel valued. Again, Stutz is an exception. I don't really value him, but the bottom line is that I think that's super important in any profession. And if my reporters don't feel valued or respected, I would hope they'd come to Elizabeth or to me and tell me that and say, you know, whatever they need to get off their chest. And I think we've created a culture where that happens.
Let me just say one thing before you ask your question. I agree, and we probably paid our staff more than most newspapers do. It was a priority of mine. We didn't have great benefits. I didn't have any benefits, so.
Did you ever take a vacation, ever?
No.
I didn't think so. Yeah, that's amazing.
But we have, I mean, have tried to untether us from the print product, just because, I mean, in the last year of our existence, we had 7 printing increases in 1 year, and our printing costs went up 70%. Our mailing costs went up exponentially and continue to go up. So it is not sustainable. The problem with doing away with the print product is all those people who call it their newspaper, they want that print edition. And I mean, we do an e-edition. We have a website. I mean, we're delivering the news, or were, in as many ways as we could. And I worked really hard to get people to switch to the e-edition. I would sit at my desk. I would invite people to come in and sit at my desk with me, and I'd show them how to use the e-edition if they had problems with it. So it's, you know, it is one of the answers. The other answer is the revenue model for our newspaper doesn't work anymore. And I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for a long time. So that's my failure. I'm not a great business manager. I love putting out a newspaper. And so that's my failure.
So you talked a little bit about Canadian being a microcosm, right? And a little preview of IndyFest, we've been lending y'all, our debaters for the last 3 years to hold debates. And the topic this year is housing as a guaranteed right. So I can't help but see in this microcosm, as a portion of it, you pay a good wage in Austin, that's great, but paying a good wage in Canadian means also moving into a community that it seems like a lot of people are moving out of, right? And finding housing, finding community within rural spaces that you're not from is even more difficult than moving in and doing journalism in other places. So has that been like a big impact on running a newspaper in a rural area?
Well, I think in general it is. We've managed to make that work. I mean, when we've hired someone from out of town, we have helped them find housing, and but they tend not to stay long. If you didn't grow up in a small town, or even if you did, sometimes the big cities got a real glow to it, and it's hard to keep kids, younger people, in a small town. But again, I'm just going to say the revenue model has to change. The old, I hate to say it, but a lot of our small businesses are dying too, because big box stores, Amazon, I mean, those businesses are dying. Mm-hmm. And, you can fight for them all you want, but they're going away. And those used to be our advertisers. So, so we had to find other ways to bring in money. And we started getting sponsors for different features that we did. We at some point at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a rancher in our town who wrote a letter to the editor one week and said, I'm worried about our newspaper. They do a good job. We want to keep our newspaper. I'm writing a check and I'm sticking it in a bank account, and I hope you'll do the same. And I was astonished at how many people.
How much got raised by that?
It was probably $30,000. I mean, it kept us alive during a very difficult time. And this is an old rancher who probably doesn't agree with my politics either. But he valued the newspaper, he valued the work we did, and he contributed. So that may be another model that we're going to have to depend on, that small newspapers are going to have to depend on at some point. So I think everything's in flux. I think how we produce a newspaper, I think what a newspaper is and how it's defined and how it looks and how it feels, all of that's going to change. In my lifetime, I've reinvented how the newspaper is done so many times. I mean, it would make your head spin. When I was packing up, when I thought we were going to sell, I was packing up things that just had laid around and just were, the detritus of, years of newspapering. And I had this box of cords. And, several generations of things that plugged in and that I couldn't even tell you what they did anymore. The variety of just plugs was astonishing. So we've changed over and over. We had a dark room, then we went to digital images. We've changed everything. We've evolved, and newspapers will continue to evolve. And I hope the next generation that comes in, if newspapers still exist, they're going to find other ways to do it. I have a young man who came to the office one day and said, hey, I have some ideas. And he gave me all kinds of suggestions and said, I want to help with it. And I'm still trying to get back to him, and we're going to work on some different ideas, and I don't know where it'll go. But I don't see newspaper people as being stuck in the mud, or this is the way we're always going to do it. I mean, we have reinvented ourselves so many times, and I have no doubt we'll do it many more times before we're gone.
And I just want to make a plug for young people going to more rural areas to report on community news, because I actually was a journalism student way back when, around the same time you were, actually. So anyway, also say, I do think that if journalism schools had some programs around this, it could be a really great way for a young person to start out, like in a small rural area or small community somewhere. I feel like you can learn so much, and you're doing everything, and so anyway, I do think that there could be ways to attract younger people. I think journalism schools could play a big part in that, and you don't have to stay there for your whole life. I mean, not nothing against Canadian, but you could, like, stay for 3-4 years or whatever, 3 years, and then go on to, but as long as there are still people who are interested in doing that, it could, yeah. Anyway, that's my plug.
So, Bev, if you're not going to turn off the lights on us, I'll see if there's any more questions. Are we okay to stay for a few more minutes? Okay, good. All right, got the thumbs up. I think there was a question here, wasn't there? No? Oh, go ahead.
I am an owner and editor of a newspaper up in Logandale, Overton, and Mesquite. The Progress newspaper is what it's called. And as I've watched your film, it's like watching my own life over the last 20 years. I have the same struggles, the same kinds of things. I guess my question is, I mean, we're at a point where our revenues are still coming in from small business. They still value the newspaper, but we're seeing it decline, right, all the time. You said yourself, a lot of times small businesses are going away, being taken over by big box stores, and you can't get ring advertising out of those guys. And so my question is, I mean, you're talking about some nonprofit models. Maybe talk a little bit about how those work, and how they would work in a smaller community.
Well, look, I can tell you that one of the things I'm seeing around the country as I travel and visit with people like John and John's staff, in states from literally Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon this year, I've been from one end to the other, is that there are a couple of institutions, some of them are philanthropic and some of them are just basically a bunch of people who got together and started something, who are talking about rolling up a bunch of the community papers, weeklies, for-profit papers, smaller ones in communities, and figuring out how they can incorporate them into some kind of nonprofit shell, a model that would give them the tax status that would allow them to ask for money in the community. I mean, the thing is, Laurie's not running a nonprofit, but yet people are contributing to help her cover her costs. There's a way to do it without changing your tax status. But I don't think your instinct is wrong about looking to alternate models to ultimately fund the work that you do. Not every community has rich people. Not every community has foundations. Not every community has companies that can afford to spend a lot of money to sponsor news organizations. But you have some people in your community who see the value of the work. You have some businesses that might be willing, with the threat of the paper going away, to step up and help you in a larger way. If you can get a 501c3 tax status, you do open up doors to some things that you don't have available to you now. It's easier than ever if you're a news organization to get that tax status. I was the CEO of the Tribune for 13 years. Texas is a big state. 30 million people, other than California, the most millionaires and billionaires of any state. We raised $120 million over those 13 years to pay for serious journalism. You don't need $120 million to continue to do what you do. You need what you need. But I would start out with the assumption that that money is available, and that having conversations with people in the community about the need for the paper and the ability to support the good work that you do, that is always a good idea. So definitely consider alternate models. I don't think all hope is lost.
I have a question. Could there be a hybrid model where there's still advertising, but yet there's still, okay.
Sure. I mean, look, one of the things that John knows and that I know is everyone around the country is watching is that the Chicago Sun-Times, which was one of the two newspapers in the city of Chicago, one of the only big cities left in the country with two papers, there are very few today, was just acquired last year by the public radio station in Chicago, WBEZ, which then converted the Chicago Sun-Times into a nonprofit. It was a $61 million deal. The MacArthur Foundation was the lead donor, but there were other donors who contributed to this, and they have effectively saved this civic institution in Chicago in the Sun-Times. In Philadelphia, you have the Philadelphia newspapers that have remained for profit. This gets back to your hybrid question, but were essentially bought by a nonprofit entity called the Lenfest Institute that was funded by a very wealthy man, Jerry Lenfest, who since died. And so they are protected from the economic uncertainty of the world by being inside a nonprofit shell. Like, people are attempting things all over the country. We were talking, Laurie and Heather and I, before we came out here today, about a newspaper in North Texas, in Denton, Texas, that was bought by a foundation and gifted to the public television station in Dallas. Like, people are trying things. And I think we have to be open to new ideas. We have to be open to conversion models or new models for doing this.
And Beverly mentioned before the screening, the article she was referencing is about this new effort by the MacArthur Foundation called Press Forward.
Right. It's more than $500 million over 5 years that's going to be invested in local news. And so we have to hope, right, that this is going to be an infusion of...
My feeling on this is that, and this kind of, completes the circle of everything we're talking about, is that the for-profit model in general is not going to be sustainable going forward because of advertising revenue and some other factors, unless you are owned by a billionaire who doesn't care about hemorrhaging money, and there are all potential problems with that. But and you can't survive, whether you're the Independent or the Texas Tribune, even just with these big corporate donors or even foundation grants. You got to get buy-in from the community, which means people giving recurring donations of even just a little bit, $5, $10, $50 a month, and you build up that foundation. Most people don't know, I don't even know if I've told Evan this, that when I started the Independent, in the first 48 hours, I got two major companies to commit $250,000 each. Both of those companies now have essentially disappeared they don't give anymore. Our biggest donor won't give to us anymore. You can't count on people who give large amounts of money being generous every year. And so you need people and that's how you get community buy-in too, is people are giving. I like the Independent. I'm going to give them $20 a month. And
in fact, the path to sustainability really is not through these big national foundations, but it's through the people in this room. It's all of you who read the Independent, who understand the importance of local news in your community. And I'm going to say, as we end here tonight, that everybody in here, if you're supporting the Independent, thank you, keep doing it, give a little bit more if you can. And if you're here as somebody's guest and you're not somebody who is already supporting the Independent, you need to support the Independent, because your community will be worse off if you don't have this reliable and growing and increasingly important source of news.
Well, let me put this in a slightly different way, and we really should wrap up, and thank you for that pitch, Evan. But when I was watching the film and you were discussing with your son that Janis Joplin song that I had not heard for a long time, so I listened to it today. And of course, the most famous line is the one that, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. But you know what the next line is? The next line is, nothing ain't worth nothing, but it's free. We're free, but it don't cost nothing. And I hope all of you in here realize that. Many of you are already generous donors. I hope you will become even more generous, and I hope those who are not here believe in us enough and not donors not only will give, but will tell your friends and your colleagues at work how important this is, how important it is that we survive, the work, the kind of work that Laurie has done in Canadian. As I'm in awe that I truly am. Because as much as I think I have to put up with grief from people, that what you have had to put up with, and the economic calamities that you have had to deal with, and so I do want to thank Heather and Evan and Laurie for making the trip out here to watch this movie and then discuss it. And I also want to thank everybody here for coming, and of course Beverly for hosting us and making this whole thing possible. Thank you very much.